He had expected a black-edged letter, a discreet notice from a country solicitor informing him that the inconvenient, sickly wife he had purchased and abandoned had finally succumbed. It was, after all, the purpose for which he had acquired her, to die quietly and settle a debt of honor his family owed hers. He did not expect to return to the rotting tomb of his ancestral home to find it breathing. He did not expect the scent of baking bread and beeswax to have replaced the stench of mildew and regret. And he certainly did not expect to find the ghost he had left for dead sitting at his own desk, ink on her fingers and fire in her eyes, looking not like a dying woman, but like a queen who had just conquered a kingdom he had long since surrendered. Alastair Beaumont, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, felt the familiar hollowness in his chest expand to accommodate the great chill of the solicitor's office. The room smelled of old paper and dust, a scent he associated with endings and obligations, the two currencies that had governed his life since the war. Outside, a relentless November rain lashed against the tall, grimy windows, each drop a tiny hammer against the fragile quiet. He stared at the document on the heavy mahogany desk, the ink still faintly damp, the script a series of elegant, binding traps. A marriage contract. It felt more like a bill of sale. Across from him, a man whose name Alastair had already forgotten, a distant cousin of the bride-to-be, fidgeted with his worn cuffs. The man's desperation was a palpable odor in the room, sharper than the dust, a cloying mix of sweat and cheap cologne. It was the smell of ruin, a scent Alastair knew well. It clung to the men who came to him for favors, for extensions on loans, for a word in the right ear at court. This man, however, was not asking for money. He was selling his ward. And then there was the commodity herself. Ilera. He had not bothered to learn her surname. It was irrelevant. She sat beside her cousin, a small, still figure wrapped in a threadbare gray shawl. She was little more than a collection of sharp angles and pale skin, her only color the feverish brightness in her large, lucid eyes. A dry, rasping cough had punctuated the solicitor's droning recitation of the terms, a sound that was both pitiful and, from Alastair's grimly practical perspective, promising. The doctors had given her a year, perhaps 2, if she were kept in a warm, dry climate. He was providing her with neither. He dipped the quill into the inkpot. The scratch of a nib on the thick parchment was the only sound for a long moment. He signed his name, Alastair Julian Beaumont, a signature that could command armies and sway Parliament, now being used to purchase a dying woman. He felt nothing. It was a transaction, a final, distasteful piece of business tied to his father's ruinous promises. His father had financially destroyed her family with a bad investment decades ago. A deathbed pledge had been made to see the last of her line cared for. This was his version of care, a dukedom in exchange for her quiet, swift demise, which would free him from the obligation and the need to ever think of it again. He pushed the document across the desk. "It is done." His voice was low, resonant, the parade ground tone that brooked no argument. It was a voice that had been scraped raw by gunpowder and grief, and had settled into this permanent, gravelly authority. The cousin snatched the paper, his eyes scanning it with a greedy haste. Relief washed over his features, making him look younger and somehow more predatory. "Your Grace, you are a man of profound honor." Alastair's lip curled, a minute, contemptuous movement. He did not reply. His gaze flickered to the woman. Ilera. Her eyes were fixed on him, and for the first time, he registered their color. They were not the soft brown or gentle blue he might have expected. They were the color of a winter sky, a clear, sharp, unforgiving gray, and they held no trace of gratitude or fear. They held only a calm, unnerving assessment. It was as if she were the one appraising the goods and had already found them wanting. A single, harsh cough escaped her, shaking her slender frame. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips, and when she drew it away, Alastair did not need to see the faint crimson stain to know it was there. "Good. It will be over soon." "My carriage is waiting," he said, rising to his full, imposing height. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and built for armor, not for drawing rooms. He felt cramped in the small office in his own life. "We will depart for Blackwood Manor at once." The cousin scrambled to his feet. "Of course, Your Grace. Alara, you must thank the Duke." Her gaze did not waver from Alistair's face. The silence stretched, thin and tight. He saw a flicker of something in those gray depths. Not defiance, exactly, but a profound and weary stillness. The stillness of a creature that has endured too much to be frightened by one more cage. "I am certain," she said, her voice a low, surprisingly steady whisper that carried a faint rasp, "that the Duke requires no thanks for fulfilling a duty he so clearly finds distasteful." Alistair felt a flicker of something himself, a ghost of an emotion too foreign to name. Annoyance? No, it was closer to surprise. He had expected tears or a trembling silence. He had not expected a sliver of steel. He dismissed it. It was the pointless bravado of the powerless. "I require nothing from you," he stated, his voice flat and cold as a tombstone. "But your silence." He turned, not waiting for a reply, and swept from the room, his long greatcoat swirling behind him like a dark wing. He left the scent of cold rain and wet wool in his wake, leaving her to follow in the custody of his obligation. He had 1,000 more important things to attend to. Matters of state, whispers of war on the continent, the slow, grinding work of holding his nation together. This small, pale woman was a footnote, a clause in a contract he intended to forget the moment it was fulfilled. The journey north was a study in miserable silence. Alara sat opposite the Duke in the cavernous, well-sprung carriage, the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof a constant, dreary companion. The air inside was thick with the unsaid, heavy with the scent of damp leather and the cold, clean fragrance of the man who was now her husband. He had not spoken a single word to her since they had left the solicitor's office. He stared out the window, his profile a harsh, handsome line against the weeping gray landscape. His thoughts were clearly 1,000 miles away, in London, in Parliament, in some war room where men made decisions that shaped the world. She was merely cargo being transported. She watched him from beneath her lashes, a covert study of her jailer. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, but he was worn in a way that had nothing to do with years. There were fine lines etched around his eyes the color of dark, turbulent water. His jaw was perpetually tight, a muscle nodding and unknodding in a steady, angry rhythm. He was a man hollowed out by duty, a magnificent ruin of a man, all granite and shadows. She saw the exhaustion clinging to him like a shroud, a profound weariness that went bone deep. She recognized it, for it was a cousin to her own. His was born of power and responsibility, hers of powerlessness and survival. Her own body was a traitor. The jolting of the carriage sent little tremors of pain through her ribs, and a persistent, tickling cough was building in her chest, a familiar enemy gathering its forces. She suppressed it, refusing to show him the weakness he had so clearly purchased her for. She would not give him the satisfaction. Let him think her a stone. Let him think her already dead. It was safer that way. Her cousin's final words to her had been a desperate, whispered plea. "Be compliant, Alara. Be gentle. He is a duke. He can make your final months comfortable." But Alara had no intention of being compliant. Compliance had gotten her nothing but a life as a poor relation, a burden to be passed around until she became this, a final asset to be liquidated. She had nothing left to lose, and in that, she found a strange, brittle freedom. After 2 days of relentless travel, the landscape began to change. The rolling hills grew wilder, the trees more skeletal and hunched against the wind. The rain turned to a sleeting, icy drizzle that clung to the windows like a cataract, blurring the world into a wash of gray and brown. The air grew colder, seeping through the carriage frame, carrying a damp, earthy scent of decay. It smelled of wet, turned soil and rotting leaves. It smelled, Alara thought with a grim twist of her lips, like an open grave. Finally, the carriage slowed, turning off the main road and onto a rutted track that was more mud than gravel. Great, skeletal branches of ancient oaks clawed at the roof, their scratching a sinister welcome. They passed through a pair of immense, wrought-iron gates, one of which hung drunkenly from a single hinge, groaning in the wind. A stone griffin, slick with green moss, stared down at them with vacant eyes. Blackwood Manor. Alistair finally stirred, his gaze leaving the window and sweeping over the grounds with a complete lack of expression. He did not seem to see the rampant neglect, the choked gardens, the crumbling balustrades. Or if he did not care. This was not a home to him. It was a place of exile. The carriage drew to a halt before a vast, Gothic monstrosity of a house. It was a pile of blackened stone, all sharp gables and menacing turrets, looming out of the mist like a rotting tooth. Half the windows were boarded up. The stone was stained with dark ribbons of damp, and the ivy that crawled up the walls was not the picturesque sort, but a thick, rapacious blanket that seemed to be actively pulling the stones apart. Smoke trickled from only one of the dozen chimneys, a thin, gray wisp immediately torn apart by the wind. The door opened, and a footman, looking as ancient and weathered as the house, lowered the steps. Alistair descended without a word, his boots sinking into the muddy gravel with a soft squelch. He did not turn. He did not offer a hand. He simply waited for her to follow. Alara gathered her thin shawl around her shoulders and slowly, carefully, stepped out of the carriage. The cold, damp air hit her with a physical force, stealing the breath from her lungs and triggering the cough she had been fighting. It was a deep, racking spasm that bent her double, and this time she could not hide the small, bright fleck of red on her handkerchief. She crumpled it in her fist, her knuckles white. When she straightened, Alistair was watching her. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes held a flicker of something she could not decipher. It was not pity. It was colder than that. It was confirmation. An elderly woman in a severe black dress stood framed in the massive, open doorway of the house. Her face was a knot of disapproval, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. "Your Grace," she said, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. "Mistress Finch," Alistair acknowledged, his tone clipped. "You received my letter." "I did, Your Grace." The housekeeper's gaze slid to Alara, and it was like being assessed by an undertaker. The look was filled with a grim, proprietary hostility. This was her house of the dead, and Alara was an unwelcome new corpse. "This is the Duchess," Alistair said, the title sounding absurd and cruel in the damp air. "She will be residing in the Queen's suite. See that she has what she needs." The implication was clear. "See that she has what she needs to die without bothering me." He turned to Alara then, his imposing form blocking out what little light there was in the dreary afternoon. The rain dripped from the brim of his hat, tracing a path down his hard cheek. "I am returning to London. My affairs there are of critical importance." Alara simply stared at him, the cold seeping into her bones. She had expected to be ignored, to be warehoused. She had not expected to be abandoned on the very doorstep. "Your affairs," she repeated, her voice a low, hoarse whisper. Yes, he did not elaborate. He did not need to. He was the Duke of Blackwood. She was nothing. "The house is yours. Do with it what you will." A muscle flickered in his jaw. "Try not to be a nuisance to the staff." It was the final, casual cruelty that broke through her frozen composure. A spark of white-hot anger flared her chest, a warmth that was almost welcome. "You mean," she said, her voice gaining a sharp, clear edge despite the rasp, "try to die quietly." For the second time, she saw a flicker of genuine surprise in his dark eyes. He almost looked unsettled, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that familiar, impenetrable mask. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible inclination of his head. It was not an apology. It was an acknowledgement of a stated fact. Then he turned his back on her. He walked to the waiting carriage without a single backward glance, a tall, dark figure swallowed by the gray mist. The carriage door slammed shut, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. The horses strained, the wheels churned in the mud, and in moments he was gone. Alara was left standing in the rain, a duchess in name only, on the threshold of a tomb. The wind whipped her shawl, and the cold mud seeped through the thin soles of her shoes. She looked up at the hostile face of the house, at the disapproving glare of the housekeeper, and felt a profound, bottomless despair threaten to swallow her whole. But beneath the despair, the small, defiant spark of anger still glowed. He had left her here to die. She lifted her chin, the movement small but resolute. She would not. The queen's suite was a magnificent, cavernous lie. It was a room designed to kill her. A vast, vaulted ceiling from which plaster dust drifted down like gentle snow was lost in shadows. The tapestries that lined the walls, depicting faded hunting scenes, were streaked with damp and smelled richly of mildew, a scent that clung to the back of Alara's throat. The air was frigid, a damp, penetrating cold that no fire seemed able to touch. A small, sullen fire did indeed smolder in the gargantuan fireplace, producing more smoke than heat, the plume of gray curling back into the room as if defeated by the sheer volume of cold air it was meant to conquer. Mistress Finch had shown her to the room with a grim satisfaction, her every movement radiating a hostile indifference. The late Duchess, His Grace's mother, preferred this room, she had stated, the words a clear warning. She found the air bracing. Alara understood. The late Duchess had likely died in this very bed, a massive, four-poster monstrosity draped in rotting velvet, its canopy casting the mattress into perpetual twilight. For a week, Alara existed within that room as a prisoner. She was brought trays of thin, flavorless broth and stale bread, delivered by a skittish young maid who refused to meet her eyes. The cold settled deep in her bones, a permanent ache that fed the sickness in her lungs. The cough became her constant companion, a deep, barking sound that echoed in the vast emptiness of the suite. She spent her days huddled in the unwelcoming bed, the sheets perpetually damp, and her nights in a feverish, shivering state that was not quite sleep. She was doing exactly what he had paid her for. She was dying. She would lie in the gloom, listening to the house groan and settle around her. It was a living thing, but it was breathing its last. She heard the scuttling of rodents in the walls, the mournful whistle of the wind through cracked window panes, the steady drip, drip, drip of water from a leak somewhere in the endless, dark corridors beyond her door. The house was a mirror of her own body, vast, neglected, and crumbling from the inside out. The despair she had felt on the doorstep returned, a heavy, suffocating blanket. It would be so easy to simply let go, to close her eyes and let the cold and the quiet take her. It was on the 8th day that something shifted. A storm had raged all night, and the drip in the corridor had become a steady trickle. Lying in the damp bed, her body racked with another bout of coughing that left her breathless and dizzy, Alara stared at a large, brown water stain on the ceiling. It looked like a map of a country she would never visit. She watched as a single, fat drop of water formed, trembled, and fell, landing with a soft plop on the threadbare rug. And in that moment, the despair receded, burned away by a sudden, white-hot clarity. She was not a stain on the ceiling. She was not a passive victim of decay. She was Alara. She had survived a childhood of neglect, the slow ruin of her family, the humiliation of her cousin's desperate bargaining. She had survived being sold. She would not be defeated by a draft and some mildew. The anger she had felt when he abandoned her returned, not as a brief spark, but as a steady, burning flame. It was a fuel, and it warmed her from the inside out. She threw back the heavy, damp covers. Her legs were weak and trembling as she stood, the floorboards like sheets of ice beneath her bare feet. She swayed, gripping the bedpost for support, her breath coming in shallow gasps. But she did not fall. She walked to the bell pull and gave it a sharp, decisive tug. Minutes later, the young maid, Mary, appeared, her eyes wide with alarm at seeing the new Duchess out of bed. Your Grace?" she stammered, twisting her apron in her hands. "My name is Alara," she said, her voice weak but firm, "and I will not be addressed as Your Grace in this mausoleum. You will call me ma'am. Is that understood? Mary blinked, then nodded dumbly. Good, Alara continued. Now I want you to go to the kitchens. I want a proper meal. Not broth. Meat if there is any. Bread that is not green. And a pot of the strongest, hottest tea you can brew. She took a breath. After that, I want you to find every spare blanket in this house, no matter how old or ugly, and bring them here. And I want more wood for this fire. Logs, not twigs. Mary stared at her as if she had grown a second head. This was not the dying woman she had been serving. This was someone else entirely. But, Mistress Finch, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Is Mistress Finch the Duchess of Blackwood? Alara's question was sharp as glass. No, ma'am. Then you'll do as I say. Now, a flicker of something, respect, perhaps, or just fear of this new, strange authority, crossed the maid's face. She curtsied, a clumsy, jerky movement, and fled. Alara stood alone in the center of the vast, cold room, her own audacity sending a tremor through her. It was a gamble. She had no real power here, but she was the Duchess, a title he had thrown at her like a curse. She would turn into a weapon. An hour later, Mary returned, her arms laden with blankets, followed by a young footman hauling a basket of logs. A tray was set on a small table near the fire, bearing a plate of cold mutton, a thick slice of dark bread, and a steaming pot of tea. It was the most beautiful sight Alara had ever seen. She ate. She ate with a slow, deliberate determination, forcing the food down, feeling the strength, however small, begin to return to her limbs. She drank the tea, letting the heat spread through her chest. Then, she directed the footman to build up the fire until it was a roaring, magnificent blaze that beat back the shadows and threw dancing light across the damp tapestries. She spent the rest of the day wrapped in a mountain of mismatched blankets in a chair pulled close to the hearth, the warmth seeping into her skin. She was not cured. Her cough still rattled in her chest, but she was no longer a victim. She was a strategist, and this house was her battlefield. The next morning, she did not wait for someone to bring her a tray. Dressed in the one serviceable wool dress she owned, she walked out of the Queen's suite and went in search of the kitchens. The house was a labyrinth of cold, echoing corridors. Dust lay thick on everything, furniture shrouded in white cloths like a congregation of ghosts. She followed the distant, faint clatter of pots and found her way to the servants' wing. She pushed open a heavy wooden door and stepped into a vast, stone-flagged kitchen. It was the one room in the house that felt alive. A huge cooking fire blazed in a hearth big enough to roast an ox, and the air smelled of yeast and wood smoke. A handful of servants looked up, their faces a mixture of shock and apprehension. At the head of a long wooden table sat Mistress Finch, a set of keys jangling at her waist, presiding over the room like a grim monarch. You are out of your bed, the housekeeper stated, her voice flat and laced with disapproval. I am, Alara said, her voice clear and carrying in the large space. She walked towards the table, her steps even, her gaze unwavering. I find I have no intention of getting back into it. She stopped before the housekeeper. I require the household account books. Mistress Finch's thin eyebrows rose. The accounts are the Duke's affair. They are managed by me in his absence. His absence is, I believe, indefinite, and as I am his wife, the accounts are now my affair. Fetch them. The standoff was electric. The kitchen staff froze, watching the silent battle of wills. Alara could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, but she did not allow it to show on her face. She held the housekeeper's gaze, pouring every ounce of her newfound will into that stare. She was the Duchess. She would not be defied by a servant, no matter how entrenched. For a long, tense moment, Mistress Finch did not move. Then, with a slow, resentful scrape of her chair, she rose. She unlocked a heavy wooden cupboard, retrieved two thick, leather-bound ledgers, and slapped them onto the table in front of Alara. The sound was like a gunshot. As you wish. Your Grace, she said, the title now laced with venom. Alara did not flinch. Thank you, Mistress Finch. I will also require a list of all current staff, their duties, and their wages, and an inventory of the larder. On my desk, in my study. She turned before the housekeeper could reply. Which room is the study? She asked, her gaze sweeping over the assembled staff. After a moment of terrified silence, a young man with soot on his cheek, the footman from the day before, pointed a trembling finger. West wing, first door on the right, ma'am. The one with the lion head handles. Thank you, Elara said. She picked up the heavy ledgers. They were a burden, but a welcome one. They were a beginning. She walked out of the kitchen, leaving a stunned and uneasy silence in her wake. She had won the first skirmish. The war for Blackwood Manor had just begun. The study was a room drowning in dust and neglect. It smelled of cold ash and decaying paper. Books lay in disordered piles on the floor, their leather bindings cracked and mildewed. A film of grime covered the surface of the grand mahogany desk, and a fine web, its architect long gone, was strung between a stack of letters and a silver letter opener. This, Elara thought with a grim satisfaction, was the heart of the rot. This was where the house's lifeblood had clotted and stopped. She set the heavy ledgers down on the desk, sending up a puff of dust that made her cough. Ignoring the spasm, she went to the heavy velvet curtains and wrenched them open. Watery sunlight, thin as gruel, struggled through the filthy panes of the bay window, illuminating a blizzard of dancing dust motes. The light revealed the full extent of the decay, but also revealed the room's good bones, the carved oak paneling, the intricate plasterwork on the ceiling, the shelves that climbed to the heavens, waiting to be filled with order instead of chaos. She had found her command post. For the next month, Elara worked with a feverish, single-minded intensity. She did not stop because she could not afford to. To stop was to let the cold and the sickness creep back in. To stop was to die. So she moved. She worked from dawn until long after the sun had set, fueled by hot tea and a burning, righteous anger. Her first act was to consolidate. The house was too vast, a wounded leviathan bleeding heat and resources from 100 unnecessary rooms. With the reluctant help of the footman, whose name she learned was Thomas, and a grizzled, quiet groundsman named Mr. Giles who seemed to watch her with a calculating curiosity, she began to close off the dead parts of the manor. They sealed the entire north wing, a labyrinth of guest suites and ballrooms that had not been used in decades. They draped the furniture in dust sheets, boarded the windows from the inside, and locked the doors. The house shrank, becoming more manageable, its remaining arteries warmer. Her headquarters were the study, the kitchen, and a small, sunny parlor next to the study that she claimed as her own. She had her meager belongings moved there from the cavernous, deadly queen's suite. She slept on a chaise lounge pulled before a well-fed fire, wrapped in the blankets she had commandeered. It was not a duchess's chamber, but it was warm, it was dry, and it was hers. The ledgers told a story of catastrophic neglect. For years, money had bled from the estate. Pensions were being paid to servants who had died a decade ago. Bills were outstanding for luxuries the house no longer possessed. The estate's tenants were paying rents to a steward in a nearby village, a man who, a single, terse letter of inquiry revealed, had been lining his own pockets for years, passing on only a fraction of the income to the Duke's oblivious London solicitors. Elara's pen flew across the page. She wrote letters. Sharp, concise, brutally efficient letters. She wrote to the solicitors in London, informing them that all estate matters were now to be directed to her, and included damning evidence of the steward's theft. She wrote to the steward himself, a single sentence dismissing him and demanding a full accounting of the missing funds, threatening legal action by the Duke's authority if he failed to comply. She wrote to every tenant, introducing herself not as the Duchess, but as the acting manager of the Blackwood estate, and instructed them to pay their rents directly to Mr. Giles, whom she had assessed, in his quiet competence, as the only man she could trust. Mistress Finch watched all of this with a simmering, silent rage. She was the old guard, the keeper of the decay, and Elara was dismantling her stagnant kingdom piece by piece. The housekeeper fought back with petty rebellions. Meals were served cold. Wood was not delivered. Fires were not lit. Alara met each act of sabotage with a calm, unyielding front. She would simply go to the kitchen herself, Thomas or Mary trailing nervously in her wake, and prepare her own food. She carried her own logs. She learned to bank a fire to last through the night. She did not complain or reprimand. She simply did. The turning point with the staff came on a bitter December morning. Alara was in the study, her fingers stained with ink, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, when Mr. Giles appeared at the door, his hat in his hands. He was a man of the earth, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by wind and sun, his hands gnarled and calloused. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. The west roof of the kitchens. The storm last night took a good portion of the slates. It's letting in water something fierce. Alara looked up from the ledger. She knew there was no money for a roofer. The accounts were a disaster, a deep well of debt. She looked at the groundsman's steady, honest face. He was not challenging her. He was presenting a problem, waiting to see what she would do. "Show me," she said simply. She followed him out into the biting wind, pulling her shawl tighter. He led her to the back of the kitchens, where a gaping hole in the roof was clearly visible. A steady stream of icy water was pouring onto the flagstones of the scullery below. Alara stared at it for a long moment, the cold air rasping in her lungs. Then she turned to Giles. "Are there any slates stored on the estate?" He nodded slowly. "In the old stable block, left over from when the late Duke had the east wing repaired 20 years ago. But ma'am, there's no one to fix it. The village men won't work for credit, not from this house." "Can you climb a ladder, Mr. Giles?" she asked. He looked taken aback. Mum, I can. And you, Thomas?" she said, turning to the young footman who had followed them out. Thomas paled. I ain't fond of heights, ma'am." "Today, you will be," Alara said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Mr. Giles, you will direct the work from the roof. Thomas, you and I will haul the slates. We will patch this roof ourselves." And so they did. For the rest of the day, Alara, the Duchess of Blackwood, worked alongside her two servants. She hauled heavy, cumbersome slates from the stables, her muscles screaming in protest, her hands raw and scraped. Mud caked her dress and boots. Sleet stung her face. But with every slate she passed up the ladder to the waiting hands of Thomas, who then passed it to Giles on the roof. She felt not weaker, but stronger. She was not just fixing a roof. She was reclaiming her life. The kitchen staff watched from the windows, their faces a gallery of astonishment. They saw their pale, sickly new mistress, her face set with grim determination, working like a common laborer in the freezing rain. They saw her refuse to stop, even when a fit of coughing bent her double. They saw her wave away Mary's offer of a coat, her focus entirely on the task at hand. By dusk, the hole was patched. It was not a perfect job, but it was solid. It would hold. That evening, as Alara sat in her study, soaking her aching feet in a basin of hot water, a knock came at the door. It was Cook, a plump, red-faced woman who had been a staunch ally of Mistress Finch. She carried a tray. On it was a steaming bowl of rich, fragrant beef stew, a heel of freshly baked bread, and a glass of deep red wine. "Cook," Alara said, surprised. "You'll need your strength, ma'am," the woman said, her voice gruff but devoid of its earlier hostility. She set the tray down. "What you did today, well, it was a proper thing." She met Alara's eyes. "The house has been waiting for someone to care." It was a declaration of allegiance. From that day on, the tide turned. The meals became hot and hearty. The fires were always lit. The small pockets of resistance led by Mistress Finch crumbled, leaving the old housekeeper isolated in her bitterness. Alara had not demanded their loyalty. She had earned it. Slowly, miraculously, the house began to breathe again. Alara discovered a walled garden, choked with weeds, but structurally sound. With Giles's expertise, they began to clear it, planning for the spring. She found a library filled with priceless books that, once cleaned and aired, filled the study shelves. She sold a set of tarnished, and used silver candelabras she found in a locked pantry, using the money to pay for a load of seasoned firewood and a side of beef. She was not a duchess presiding over a grand estate. She was a survivor, hoarding resources, making her fortress sound against the coming winter. Her health, against all odds, improved. The constant work, the warm rooms, the good food, they were a better medicine than any doctor could have prescribed. The cough was still there, a shadow in her lungs, but it no longer ruled her. Her cheeks gained a touch of color. Her eyes, once fever-bright, now shone with a clear, focused intelligence. One afternoon in early spring, 6 months after her arrival, she stood at the window of her study. The sun, a rare and welcome visitor, streamed in, illuminating the polished wood of the desk and the neat stacks of account books. Outside, the first brave shoots of crocuses were pushing through the damp earth near the south-facing wall. Mr. Giles was in the distance, mending a section of collapsed fence. From the kitchens, she could smell the scent of baking bread. The house was no longer a tomb. It was quiet, yes, but it was the quiet of contentment, not of death. She had come here to die. Instead, she had built a life. A small, quiet, fiercely protected life, walled in by the ruins of his neglect. She rarely thought of the Duke anymore. He was a ghost, a name on a piece of paper, a distant, irrelevant memory. This was her world now. She was its ruler, and she was content. Alistair rode through the gates of Blackwood and did not recognize his own home. He had been riding for 3 days, fleeing London, fleeing the suffocating press of politics, the endless demands, the hollow victories. He was bone-weary, a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that felt older than the war. The king had granted him a month's leave, a reward for navigating a particularly nasty trade dispute. The king had suggested he rusticate, and Alistair had laughed, a harsh, grating sound. His only country estate was a grave, and it was to that grave he was heading. He craved the silence, the rot, the absolute nothingness of Blackwood. He wanted to be left alone in the place where his family's ambitions had finally died. He had expected to see the gate still hanging from its hinge, a permanent sneer. Instead, it stood straight and true, the ironwork clean of rust, swinging open smoothly at his approach. He had expected the drive to be a morass of mud and weeds. Instead, the gravel was raked and level, the verges neatly trimmed. The skeletal oak branches that had clawed at his carriage 6 months ago had been pruned back, allowing sunlight to dapple the path. A sense of profound dislocation settled over him. This was not the Blackwood he remembered. This was not the tomb he sought. As the house itself came into view, the feeling intensified into outright shock. The monstrous, rotting facade was clean. The blackened stone had been scrubbed in places, revealing the pale, gray granite beneath. The ivy had been stripped away from the main block of the house, its ghostly tendrils still visible, but its destructive grip broken. Most of the boarded-up windows on the main and west wings were now glazed and shining in the late afternoon sun. And from 4 chimneys, plumes of pale, fragrant wood smoke rose into the clear spring air. The house was alive. He reined in his horse, a magnificent black stallion that was as restless and ill-tempered as its master, and simply stared. His mind, trained to assess battlefield logistics in a single glance, struggled to process the information. It was impossible. The estate had been a financial black hole for 2 generations. It had been left in the hands of an ancient, intractable housekeeper and a dying girl. It should have collapsed further into ruin. It should have been a husk. A man he vaguely recognized as the groundsman, Giles, was walking toward the stables. He saw Alistair and stopped, his expression unreadable. He did not bow or scrape. He simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of simple, man-to-man acknowledgement. "Your Grace," the groundsman said, his voice even. "We weren't expecting you." The "we" was jarring. "Evidently," Alistair replied, his own voice tight. He swung down from his horse, his long coat settling around his dusty boots. He felt like an intruder. "What has happened here?" Giles's gaze shifted towards the house. A flicker of something, pride, loyalty, warmed his weathered features. "The Duchess happened, Your Grace." The Duchess. For a stunned moment, Alistair had forgotten her entirely. The pale, coughing girl he had abandoned in the rain. He had received no black-edged letter. He had assumed it was merely a matter of time, an administrative oversight. The thought that she might still be alive had simply not occurred to him. "She is alive," he stated, the words feeling clumsy and foolish on his tongue. A dry, almost amused smile touched the groundsman's lips. "Very much so." He took the reins of Alistair's horse. "She'll be in the study. This time of day." The study. His father's study. A room he had not set foot in for 15 years. A place he associated with angry words, broken promises, and the smell of stale brandy. Alistair strode towards the front door, his sense of dislocation mounting with every step. The door itself was new, or at least newly painted, a deep, dignified black. It opened before he reached it, and a young footman he did not recognize stood there, looking neat and alert. "Your Grace," the young man said, his eyes wide but his posture correct. Alistair brushed past him without a word, his boots echoing on the clean, polished stone of the entrance hall. The air did not smell of mildew and damp. It smelled of beeswax and something else, something clean and herbal like rosemary. The congregation of shrouded furniture ghosts was gone. A long runner covered the floor, its colors rich and vibrant. A vase of early daffodils sat on a polished side table, a splash of defiant yellow in the gloom. He followed the remembered path to the west wing, his movements stiff, his mind reeling. He felt a rising tide of irritation, of anger. This was an invasion. His sanctuary of decay had been violated. His tomb had been turned into a home, and he had no place in it. He reached the study door, the one with the heavy brass lion-head handles. They gleamed, polished to a high shine. He pushed the door open and stopped dead on the threshold. The room was unrecognizable. Sunlight poured through the clean windows of the bay, illuminating a space that was not just clean, but ordered, functional, and humming with a quiet energy. The books were on the shelves, arranged by size and color. The desk, his father's desk, was clear of everything but a neat stack of papers, a bottle of ink, and a single, elegant pen. And sitting at the desk was a woman he did not know. It was her, of course, the pale, sharp-angled girl, but she was transformed. Her hair, which he remembered as a lank, lifeless brown, was coiled in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck, shining with health. The gray, sickly pallor of her skin had been replaced by a smooth, creamy complexion, with a faint, healthy flush on her cheeks. She was still slender, but she no longer looked fragile. She looked formidable. She was wearing a simple, dark blue dress, the cuffs pushed back to her elbows. Her hands, which were resting on an open ledger, were stained with ink. She looked up as he entered, her head tilting slightly, and he saw her eyes, that same clear, unnerving gray. But the weary stillness was gone. Now, they were sharp, intelligent, and held a spark of something that looked dangerously like amusement. She did not look like a ghost. She looked magnificent. The silence stretched. He was the Duke. He was the master of this house. He should have spoken, issued a command, demanded an explanation. But the words caught in his throat. He could only stare. Finally, he found his voice. It came out harsher than he intended, a rusty, accusatory rasp. "You're alive." Alara's lips curved into a slow, cool smile. It did not reach her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, the very picture of a woman in command of her domain. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said, her voice a low, smooth contralto, the consumptive rasp completely gone. "I assure you, I did my best to oblige you." The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it struck him like a physical blow. He had left her to rot, and she was mocking him for it. He took a step into the room, the door swinging shut behind him, plunging the hallway back into shadow. He felt large, clumsy, and utterly out of place. The room was hers. The air in it was hers. He was the intruder. "What have you done?" he demanded, gesturing vaguely at the room, the house, the impossible, infuriating cleanliness of it all. "My apologies," Your Grace, she said, her tone laced with a fine, sharp irony. I was under the impression you told me to do with it what I will. I have. I have prevented it from collapsing into a pile of rubble. Was that not your intention? My intention, he bit out, advancing on the desk, was for this place to be left in peace. It was not at peace, she countered, her voice hardening, the amusement vanishing. She rose from her chair, not in deference, but to meet his height, to face him as an equal. She was not tall, but she possessed an unnerving stillness that gave her stature. It was dying. A loud, messy, expensive death. I have merely stabilized the patient. He stopped on the other side of the desk, the heavy piece of furniture a barricade between them. He could smell the faint scent of ink and old paper from where he stood, and a subtle, clean, personal scent that was just her. It was infuriating. You have taken liberties, he said, his voice a low growl. I have taken charge, she corrected him. There is a difference. Someone had to. Your steward was robbing you blind. Your staff were unpaid and demoralized. Your roof was leaking. I have balanced the books, dismissed a thief, and patched the roof. You are, in fact, considerably less in debt than when you left. You're welcome. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking at his neglect, his detachment, his failure. He, the man who managed the finances of a nation, had allowed his own home to be plundered. He, the commander who prided himself on the loyalty of his men, had abandoned his own people. She had seen his failure, dissected it, and solved it, and she was presenting it to him as a bill. A cold fury, deeper and more potent than any he had felt in years, rose in him. It was the fury of a man whose carefully constructed defenses have been breached. He had come here for oblivion, and he had found accountability. This is my house, he said, planting his hands on the desk and leaning forward, using his size and presence as a weapon, as he had done with ministers and generals. My accounts, my staff, you are here on my sufferance. Alara did not flinch. She did not back away. She held her ground, her chin lifted, her gray eyes like chips of flint. Your house was a ruin, she said, her voice quiet but ringing with absolute conviction. Your accounts were a fiction, and your staff, she added, her voice dropping lower, colder, now answer to me. You may have the title, Your Grace, but I have the keys. She held up a ring of heavy iron keys, the ones that had always hung from Mistress Finch's belt. They swayed gently from her ink-stained fingers, a symbol of her quiet, total victory. Alistair stared at the keys, then at her face, at the unyielding strength in her eyes. The hollow space in his chest, the one he had come here to fill with silence and decay, was now filled with a roaring, unfamiliar storm of rage, humiliation, and a grudging, infuriating sliver of respect. He had bought a dying bird to place in a cage. He had returned to find the cage rebuilt, and the bird had become a dragon, and it was sleeping on his hoard. The days that followed were a cold war fought in echoing corridors and over silent dinner tables. Alistair found himself a stranger in his own home, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that had formed in his absence. The house ran on a rhythm he did not know, a rhythm set by her. He would wake to the distant sounds of the kitchen coming to life, the smell of baking bread a taunt. He would see her from his window, walking the grounds with Mr. Giles, pointing, planning, her head bent in serious conversation. She was a constant, infuriating presence, a living embodiment of his own abdication. The staff treated him with a formal, distant courtesy that was more alienating than open hostility. They called him Your Grace, but their loyalty, he could see, was not his. When he issued an order, it was met with a flicker of hesitation, a subtle glance in the direction of the study, as if seeking a higher authority's confirmation. He was the Duke, but she was the master. He tried to reassert his authority. He demanded the account books. She delivered them to his temporary chambers. He refused to sleep in the master's suite, which she had aired and cleaned but left pointedly unoccupied, with a cool, professional air, as if he were a visiting auditor. He spent a night poring over them, his military mind trying to find a flaw, a mistake, a point of attack. He found none. Her notations were precise, her logic impeccable. She had saved the estate from bankruptcy with a ruthless, pragmatic efficiency he would have admired in one of his quartermasters. In his wife, it was a condemnation. They ate their meals in the grand, drafty dining hall, a cavernous space she had not yet had the time or resources to reclaim. They sat at opposite ends of a table that could seat 40. The vast expanse of polished wood between them a stark and silent battlefield. The food, prepared by a cook now fiercely loyal to Alara, was simple, hearty, and delicious. It tasted like ashes in Alistair's mouth. He watched her. He studied her, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the memory of the frail, dying girl. She ate with a healthy appetite. Her hands were steady. The only sign of her former illness was a faint, lingering paleness and the fact that she always kept a heavy shawl around her shoulders, even when the room was warm. She met his gaze across the table, her own expression unreadable, calm, and utterly self-possessed. She was waiting for him to make a move. The tension in the house grew thick and suffocating. It was in the air, in the silence, in the careful way the servants moved around them both. Alistair felt his carefully controlled composure begin to fray. He had come here for peace, for the quiet of the grave, and instead he had found this constant, silent conflict. He had found life, and it was infuriating. The breaking point came after a week of this tense cohabitation. A late spring storm blew in from the coast, a furious squall of wind and rain that rattled the window panes and sent drafts howling through the old house. The storm seemed to mirror the tempest inside him. He had spent the day riding, pushing his stallion to its limits, trying to outrun the rage and confusion that churned within him. He returned soaked to the skin, his mood as black as the churning clouds. He found her in the walled garden. The rain had momentarily eased to a drizzle, and she was on her knees in the dark, rich soil, her skirts hitched up, her hands covered in mud. She was carefully transplanting young, fragile-looking seedlings from a small wooden flat into a newly prepared bed, shielding them from the wind with her own body. He stood watching her for a long moment, the water dripping from his hair onto his shoulders. She was so absorbed in her task that she hadn't heard him approach. There was a fierce, protective tenderness in her movements, a gentle focus that was utterly at odds with the sharp, cool woman who faced him across the dinner table. She was nurturing this patch of earth with the same ferocious determination with which she had resurrected the house. And the sight of it, for some reason, broke the last of his restraint. "What in God's name are you doing?" he snarled. She startled, her head jerking up. Her face was smudged with dirt, and her hair was coming loose from its pins, tendrils of it plastered to her damp cheeks by the rain. She looked up at him, her gray eyes wide for a moment before they narrowed. "I am planting lettuces," she said, her voice clipped. "If we're to eat this summer, they must go in the ground. Or did you intend for us to subsist on your foul temper?" "This is absurd," he said, stalking towards her, his boots sinking into the soft earth. "You are the Duchess of Blackwood. You're not a common gardener. Get up. I'm the person who is ensuring this estate does not starve," she shot back, staying firmly on her knees, her posture defiant. "A title is a useless thing when your larder is empty. A lesson you, apparently, never learned. I gave you this title. I gave you this house," he thundered, the rage finally boiling over. "I gave you a place to die in dignity, and you have repaid me by turning my life into a farce." She rose then, slowly, gracefully, wiping her muddy hands on her apron. The rain began to fall harder, plastering her simple dress to her frame, but she seemed not to notice. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold fire that matched his own. "You gave me nothing," she said, her voice low and shaking with a passion he had never heard from her before. "You bought me. You bought me like a piece of livestock you expected to expire, and you dumped me on a dung heap to rot. You did not give me a place to die in dignity. You gave me a tomb and commanded me to be quiet about it." She took a step closer to him, her chin jutting out. "But you made a mistake, Your Grace. You underestimated me. You thought I was as broken as this house. You thought I would crumble. But I did not. I took the stones of this prison you built for me, and I built a life. This, she swept a hand around, indicating the neat garden beds, the repaired walls, the distant, warm lights of the house. This is not yours. You abandoned it. It is mine. I earned it with my own 2 hands. Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow, stripping away his anger and leaving him exposed, raw. She was right. He had done all of that. He had been cruel, not with active malice, but with a cold, detached indifference that was somehow worse. He had treated her not as a person, but as an inconvenient problem to be disposed of. The rain was a deluge now, soaking them both, running in rivulets down their faces. He saw her shiver, a violent tremor that shook her entire body. He saw the way she wrapped her arms around herself, the way her face suddenly seemed more pale, more drawn. And in that moment, the rage died, replaced by a sudden, sharp stab of something else. A cold dread. He remembered the cough, the handkerchief, the doctor's prognosis. "You are getting soaked," he said, his voice suddenly rough, stripped of its anger. "You will make yourself ill." A bitter, harsh laugh escaped her. "And wouldn't that solve all your problems, Your Grace?" Finally, the convenient death you paid for. Before he could answer, a racking cough seized her. It was not the faint, rasping sound he remembered. It was a deep, brutal spasm that bent her double, stealing her breath. She staggered, one hand flying to her chest, the other bracing against a stone wall. The sound was horrifying, a wet, tearing sound from deep within her lungs. Alistair froze, the blood running cold in his veins. This was not a mild illness. This was the sound of a body tearing itself apart. The coughing fit subsided, leaving her gasping, leaning heavily against the wall for support. She was shaking uncontrollably, her face ashen in the gray light. She tried to straighten up, to regain her composure, but another, weaker cough shook her, and he saw her sway. Without thinking, without conscious thought, he closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He caught her as her knees buckled, scooping her up into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, a fragile collection of bones and drenched wool. She stiffened in his arms, a protest forming on her lips, but she was too weak to fight. Her head fell back against his shoulder, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Put me down," she whispered, the words barely audible over the drumming of the rain. "Be silent," he commanded, his voice a low, harsh growl. But there was no anger in it now, only a raw, unfamiliar urgency, a threat of panic. He turned and carried her back towards the house, his long strides eating up the ground. Her wet hair was plastered against his neck, and he could feel the alarming heat of a fever radiating through her soaked dress. Her eyes were closed, her face a stark, white mask of pain and exhaustion. He had wanted her to die. He had wished for it, planned on it. But as he held her fragile, feverish body against his chest, a fierce, primal terror seized him. He had been wrong. He did not want her to die at all. He carried her through the kitchen door, startling the staff who were gathered by the fire. Cook let out a small cry, her hands flying to her mouth. Mistress Finch, standing apart, merely raised a thin eyebrow, her expression one of grim, vindicated satisfaction. Alistair ignored them all. He strode through the warren of corridors, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the clean floors, his mind a maelstrom of self-recrimination and a sharp, unfamiliar fear. He took her not to the cold queen's suite, but to her own small, warm parlor. He laid her gently on the chaise lounge before the fire, which was burning low. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering, though her skin burned with fever. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed and unfocused. "Thomas," he bellowed, his voice echoing in the house. "More wood. Now, and tell Mary to bring every blanket she can find." He knelt beside the chaise, his mind racing. He was a commander of men. He knew how to deal with battle wounds, with cannon fire, with the logistics of an army. He did not know how to deal with this. He did not know how to fight an enemy that was inside her, an enemy he himself had invited in by leaving her to the cold mercy of this house. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he brushed the wet hair from her forehead. Her skin was shockingly hot. She flinched at his touch, a low moan escaping her lips. "Leave me be," she murmured, her voice a thread of sound. "No," he said, the word raw. Mary and Thomas burst into the room, their arms full. He directed them with sharp, clipped commands, the familiar tone of authority a thin shield against the panic churning in his gut. He had them build the fire into a roaring blaze. He stripped the wet, muddy dress from Alara's unresisting form with a detached, impersonal efficiency, his hands clumsy on the buttons. He wrapped her in a dry linen sheet and then piled the blankets on top of her until she was buried in a mountain of woolen down. He sent Thomas to ride for the nearest doctor, a man in a village 10 miles away, knowing it would be hours before he could possibly arrive. And then there was nothing to do but wait. He pulled a chair to the side of the chaise and sat, his vigil beginning. The house fell silent around them, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the storm still raging outside, and the sound of her breathing. It was a shallow, labored, terrifying sound. He watched her. He watched the flush on her cheeks, the way her eyelids fluttered in a feverish dream, the slight tremor that constantly ran through her body. He saw the blue veins beneath the translucent skin of her temples. He had never truly looked at her before. He had seen a commodity, an inconvenience, a symbol of his family's foolish honor. He had not seen the woman. Now he saw her, and she was dying, and it was his fault. The guilt was a physical thing, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had done this. His coldness, his neglect. He had thrown her into the damp and the rot, and the sickness had taken root. And then, when she had miraculously fought it back, when she had performed a miracle of sheer will and transformed his ruin into a refuge, he had returned. And with his anger and his pride, he had driven her back out into the storm. Hours passed. He did not move. Cook brought a tray with food, but he ignored it. He simply sat and watched and listened to the ragged sound of her breath, each one a fresh accusation. Sometime after midnight, she began to murmur, caught in the grip of the fever. Her words were disjointed, fragments of memory. She spoke of ledgers, of the price of seed, of mending a roof. She was still working, even in her delirium. She was still fighting. Then her tone changed, became pleading. "Just a little longer," she whispered. "I'm not ready. Please." Alistair felt something inside him break. The iron wall he had built around his heart, the one that had survived the war, the death of his brother, the crushing weight of his dukedom, crumbled into dust. He reached out and took her hand. It was small and hot in his own large, calloused one. Her fingers stirred, curling weakly around his. "I am here," he said, his voice thick. "I am not leaving." He didn't know if she heard him, but he said it again, a vow made to the fire and the storm and the woman burning up beside him. "I am here." He sat with her through the long, dark night, holding her hand, bathing her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. He became her anchor to the world, the one solid point in her fevered storm. He, who had been the agent of her destruction, now willed her to live with every fiber of his being. He found himself praying, a thing he had not done in 20 years, making desperate, silent bargains with a God he did not believe in. Let her live, and I will do anything. The doctor, a portly, tired-looking man, finally arrived near dawn. He examined Alara, his face grim. He listened to her chest with a stethoscope, his expression growing graver with every passing second. He straightened up and faced Alistair, who had risen to his feet and stood like a stone sentinel. "Your Grace," the doctor said quietly, "her lungs are severely congested. The fever is dangerously high. It is a crisis of the consumption. What can be done?" Alistair's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a stark contrast to the terror clawing at him. The doctor sighed, polishing his spectacles. "We could try to bring the fever down. We can keep her warm and comfortable. But in this state, it is in God's hands now." He looked at Alistair, his gaze surprisingly direct. "She has been overexerting herself. Her constitution is fragile. Whatever strength she has built up over the last months, she has spent it all. It was another nail in the coffin of his guilt. After the doctor left some laudanum for pain and instructions that amounted to little more than palliative care, Alistair dismissed him. He stood alone again in the quiet room. The storm had passed. The first pale, gray light of dawn was filtering through the window. Alara was still, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. He had been given a death sentence. He refused to accept it. He remembered things from the field hospitals during the war. Remedies for lung fever, poultices, steam, desperate measures for desperate times. He went to the kitchen. Cook and Mary were there, their faces pale with worry. "I need boiling water," he commanded, "and mustard, flour, and linen cloths, and eucalyptus oil, if there is any." They stared at him, this formidable, terrifying duke, now with his cravat undone, his shirt rumpled, and a wild, desperate look in his eyes. But they did not question him. They flew to do his bidding. For the next 2 days, Alistair did not sleep. He became a nurse, a caregiver, his entire world shrinking to the space of that one room. He mixed pungent mustard poultices and applied them to her chest and back, the heat designed to draw out the inflammation. He filled basins with boiling water and eucalyptus, draping a sheet over her head to force her to inhale the steam, hoping to clear her lungs. He trickled water and thin broth between her lips when she was conscious enough to swallow. He talked to her. He didn't know why. He just knew the silence was the sound of defeat. He told her about the estate, about the things he hadn't noticed she had done. He told her about his horse. He told her about the political mess in London he had run away from. He talked and talked, his voice a low, steady rumble, filling the room, trying to tether her to the world of the living. On the third morning, the fever broke. He had been dozing in the chair, his head fallen back, when a small sound woke him. He looked over. Alara's eyes were open. They were no longer glazed and unfocused. They were clear, and they were fixed on him. He sat up, his heart pounding. "You look," she whispered, her voice a fragile, papery rasp, absolutely terrible. A short, sharp bark of a laugh escaped him. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the most honest sound he had made in years. "So do you," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. A faint smile touched her lips. Her gaze fell to her hand, which was still loosely held in his. She looked at their joined hands for a long moment, then back up at his face. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of confusion, exhaustion, and a dawning, fragile wonder. "You stayed," she whispered. "I stayed," he confirmed, his grip on her hand tightening just enough to let her know he was real. She had faced death, and he had stood guard. The war between them was over. He didn't know what came next, but he knew, with an absolute, bone-deep certainty, that he would not be leaving her side. In the quiet aftermath of the fever, a fragile truce settled over the house. The silence that had once been a weapon between them became something else entirely, a space for healing. Alara's recovery was slow, a painstaking reclamation of strength. She spent her days on the chaise lounge, propped up by pillows, the fire always burning brightly. Alistair remained a constant, quiet presence. The great Duke of Blackwood, the man who commanded the attention of kings, now measured his days by the cups of beef broth she managed to drink and the slow return of color to her cheeks. He discovered a startling, almost comical ineptitude for domestic tasks. His first attempt to make her tea resulted in a brew that was both weak and bitter, a feat she declared truly remarkable. He learned to stoke a fire without filling the room with smoke. He read to her from the books in the study, his low, resonant voice, once used to issue commands, now weaving tales of adventure and history in the quiet parlor. He found he had a talent for it. One afternoon, she was looking over the household accounts, which Mary had brought to her. She was frowning, a small line of worry between her brows. Alistair, who had been watching the rain drift across the gardens, turned to look at her. "What is it?" he asked. "The accounts are a mess," she murmured, her voice still weak, but regaining its characteristic crispness. "My entries for the last 2 weeks are illegible." And I have not authorized payment for the new seed order, she sighed, a sound of pure frustration, and let the ledger slide from her lap. I cannot do it. I am too weak. It was the first confession of weakness he had ever heard from her. It was not a plea for pity, but a simple statement of fact. He walked over and picked up the ledger. He looked at the pages, at her familiar, neat script devolving into a shaky, fevered scrawl before stopping altogether. "Tell me what to do," he said simply. She looked up at him, surprised. I have some small experience with numbers," he said, a hint of dry humor in his voice. He pulled a small table and a straight-backed chair closer to her chaise. "Dictate. I will be your scribe." And so a new partnership was formed. She, the general, would issue her quiet commands from her sickbed, and he, the soldier, would execute them. He wrote letters in his strong, clear hand. He tallied columns of figures. He listened as she explained her strategies for the estate. The fields to be left fallow, the timber to be sold, the tenants whose rent should be lowered in exchange for labor. He saw the intricate, beautiful machine she had built in her mind, and he was filled with a profound sense of awe. She was not just a survivor. She was a creator, a builder. During these sessions, the last of his pride and arrogance sloughed away, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. He saw the estate not as his neglected inheritance, but as her kingdom, a world she had brought back from the brink. He was merely a visitor, a privileged guest. One evening, as they worked, a log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks onto the hearth rug. Without thinking, Alistair lunged forward, using his boot to stamp out the embers. In his haste, he stumbled, his hand bracing against the arm of her chaise to steady himself. His fingers brushed against her arm. The contact was brief, accidental, but sent a jolt through them both. It was not a romantic touch. It was grounding, anchoring, a simple, physical acknowledgement of their shared space, their shared reality. He pulled his hand back as if burned, a flush creeping up his neck. She merely looked at him, her gray eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. Neither of them spoke of it, but the air in the room had changed. The quiet was no longer just comfortable. It was charged. As her strength returned, she began to take short walks, leaning on his arm. At first, it was a necessity. Her legs were still unsteady, but soon it became a habit. They would walk the gardens as the spring sun grew warmer, her hand resting lightly in the crook of his elbow. He found himself adjusting his long stride to match her slower pace. They talked, not of the past, not of his abandonment or her anger. They talked of the present, of the estate. He asked her questions, genuinely curious about her plans. He offered suggestions, not as a duke issuing orders, but as a partner offering an opinion. He told her of his own lands in the south, of agricultural techniques he had seen on the continent. She listened, her sharp mind absorbing, questioning, challenging. He learned about her. He learned that her sharp tongue hid a deep, pragmatic kindness. He learned that she had a dry, cynical wit that he found utterly captivating. He learned that the scent of rosemary he had noticed was from the small sachets she tucked into the linen closets. He learned that she loved the clarity of numbers and the logic of a well-run farm. She learned about him. She learned that beneath the cold, authoritative exterior was a man weighed down by a grief he never spoke of, for his brother, lost in the war, for a father whose failures he was still trying to outrun. She saw the exhaustion that clung to him, the burden of a duty he felt he could never set down. She saw the vulnerability he had shown at her bedside, the raw fear that he now tried to hide again behind his ducal mask. But she had seen it, and she could not forget it. The house healed around them. With the coming of summer, the gardens flourished under Giles's care and her direction. The rooms were filled with light and the scent of flowers and beeswax. The sounds of the house were no longer groans and creaks, but the quiet hum of a place that was cared for, a place that was a home. Alistair realized one day, with a sense of profound shock, that he was happy. The hollowness in his chest was gone. It had been filled, not with the silence he had craved, but with the quiet rhythms of this life, with the warmth of the fire in her parlor, with the steady, reassuring presence of the woman who had become the center of his world. He had come to Blackwood seeking a grave. He had found his life. The old world arrived on a brilliant morning in late June, in the form of a royal courier. The man's horse was lathered, his uniform immaculate despite the dust of the road, and the leather dispatch case chained to his wrist spoke of urgency and importance. He looked utterly alien against the backdrop of the quiet, sun-drenched courtyard. Alistair and Alara were in the walled garden, inspecting the rows of flourishing vegetables. She was laughing, a low, lovely sound he had only recently begun to hear, at his clumsy attempt to identify a parsley plant. The sound died in her throat as she saw the courier dismount. Alistair saw the change in her instantly. The warmth and light in her face vanished, replaced by a cool, guarded mask. Her hand, which had been resting on his arm, fell away. She took a half-step back, creating a distance between them that was far greater than a few inches. The truce was over. The walls were back up. He felt a cold dread snake its way into his gut. He knew what this was. He had been expecting it, dreading it. His leave was over. London was calling him back. The courier approached, his gaze fixed on Alistair, bowing stiffly. "Your Grace." An urgent dispatch from His Majesty. Alistair took the sealed letter, his thumb tracing the heavy wax of the royal crest. He did not need to open it. He knew what it would say. A new crisis on the continent. A cabinet meeting. A command disguised as a request. His duty. He looked at Alara. She was not looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on some distant point over the garden wall, her profile as cool and remote as a marble statue. She had already accepted his departure. She was preparing for his absence, just as she had before. She was retreating back into her fortress, ready to weather the storm of his abandonment alone. The courier cleared his throat. "I am instructed to await your reply, Your Grace." "Go to the kitchens," Alistair said, his voice quiet. "Cook will give you something to eat. I will summon you." The man bowed again and retreated, leaving them alone in the sunlit garden. The air was thick with the scent of warm earth and blooming roses, but all Alistair could feel was a gathering chill. "Well," Alara said, her voice brittle and overly formal, "it seems your holiday is at an end. I trust your affairs in London require your immediate attention." She was throwing his own cruel words from 6 months ago back in his face. It was a shield of defense, and it cut him to the quick. "Alara," he began, taking a step toward her. "You should pack," she continued, turning her back on him and beginning to inspect a row of peas with a fierce, unnatural focus. "The roads are good this time of year. You will make good time." Her rejection was so total, so absolute. It was like a physical blow. She was shutting him out completely. She had learned her lesson well. Do not rely on him, for he will always leave. The progress they had made, the fragile trust they had built, was turning to dust before his eyes. He looked down at the letter in his hand. It represented his entire life before this place. Power, responsibility, the endless, grinding weight of the dukedom. It was a life of hollow victories and profound loneliness. He had run from it once, seeking oblivion. He would not run back to it now. He knew, in that moment, with a clarity that was as sharp and pure as Alara's gaze, what he had to do. His duty was no longer to a king or a country. His duty was here, in this garden, with this woman. He walked over to the small iron brazier that Giles used to burn diseased leaves. A few embers still glowed within it. He did not hesitate. He held the king's dispatch to the embers. The wax seal blackened, melted, and the corner of the parchment caught fire. Alara gasped, whirling around. "What are you doing?" "That's from the king." He watched the flames consume the elegant script, turning the urgent commands to black, curling ash. The fire reflected in his dark eyes. "My affairs in London," he said, his voice low and steady, "are of no importance whatsoever." He let the last of the burning letter fall into the brazier. He turned to face her, his heart pounding in his chest. Her face was a mask of stunned disbelief, her gray eyes wide, her lips slightly parted. "I am not leaving," he said. He closed the distance between them, stopping just before her. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate hollow of her throat. For my entire life, he said, his voice raw with a truth he was only just beginning to understand himself. I have been a duke. I have been a soldier. I have been a son. All titles, all duties. I have never had a home. I thought this place was a tomb, a repository for all the failures of my family. I was wrong. He reached out, not to touch her, but as a plea, his hand opened between them. You are not in my home, Elara. I am in yours. You did not just rebuild this house. You gave a heart. You gave a soul. You are its heart. You are its soul. His voice dropped to a whisper. You are my home. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She stared at him, her defenses crumbling, the shock and disbelief in her eyes slowly, miraculously, giving way to a dawning, fragile hope. She had built her fortress so carefully, stone by stone, to protect herself from him, from the pain of his inevitable departure. And he had just torn it down, not with force, but with a simple, devastating declaration. You will stay, she whispered, the question fragile as a bird's wing. I will stay, he vowed, if you will have me. She didn't answer with words. She closed the final inch of distance between them and leaned her forehead against his chest. A shudder ran through her, a great, cleansing tremor, as the tension, the fear, the lonely self-reliance of a lifetime finally gave way. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. She felt so small, so right in his arms. He was her anchor, and she was his harbor. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the warm afternoon sun, the scent of roses and wood smoke mingling in the air around them. The courier, forgotten, could wait. London could fall. The world outside these old stone walls could burn. It no longer mattered. Winter was coming, but for the first time, neither of them was afraid. They would face it together. There were two survivors, two builders, two halves of a whole. They stood, a permanent fixture against the turning of the seasons, in the house that was no longer a tomb, but a fortress. A home, fiercely alive and completely, finally whole.